Connection is not perfect. Hi, Sid.
It's How
are you doing?
You've met Arnon, right?
No, I haven't had the pleasure yet. I've read what you sent. We're very impressed.
Yeah, he hangs out at the Kikar also.
Oh, yeah, we've met. Now that I think about it, I couldn't match the. Yeah, briefly.
Yeah, I'm not sure we've been formally introduced, but definitely we saw each other a few times for sure.
Exactly. That was. You come over and say hello to Sid. That's the.
Yeah.
That's fantastic to hear. So I'm very excited to listen to the stuff you have to say. That's fantastic. Sid, I'm gonna drop the video and voice for now because I think the connection is not great.
Excuse me for a second. I have to get my alarm just went off on my Nayad.
Okay, I'm gonna get the video off because the connection is really looks shaky.
Okay.
So I see a lot of people joined in. That's good. All right. So good luck with the lecture, Arnon.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Just getting my presentation ready for a moment so I can share it with everyone.
Yeah, that would be another challenge here, but you'll see.
Right.
All right.
Everyone bear with me for just a moment. I'd like to bring up the presentation.
Perfect.
Microsoft. Yeah, it's visible, the screenshot?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
What I also need to do is just to see that I can get my notes visible in parallel. So bear with me here for just a bit longer.
So, Kripa, is Bhavani there?
Yes, she is.
And I'm mute. I'm here with Sophia.
Okay.
Hi, Arnon. Nice to see you again.
Hi.
It's a long time.
Yes, has been.
And it was a wonderful article, and it was so impressive. I sent it out to a whole bunch of other people to read. Thank you.
Nice.
Look
Happy
forward
to hear. So before we jump in and Sid and the others, please help me out here. How do we get to a point where we have a good idea of who's around the table, so to speak, just so we kind of, I was planning to obviously introduce myself. And in terms of seeing everybody else, I don't see anybody else's video at this point. just give me a clue here in terms of how you typically run these meetings. Do you do all video? Do you do just everybody's kind of on mute and in audio only, and I present, and then we have the discussion? So when can we just have a bit of a joint understanding of who's around the table?
Okay, first of all, good question. So we've done it in different ways. It might be a good idea if everybody can turn on their video. So at least Arnon will not be speaking into the screen only. So that's number one. So why don't we try that? I don't think we've ever done it before. So why don't we try that and see if it works or if it's distracting.
The only problem is for us here, it may decrease the quality of our connection. So, like if we were to do it for the whole presentation.
Okay.
We don't
Okay.
have it maybe.
But even for a few seconds, this is just wonderful to see everyone. So I appreciate that for turning that on even for a few seconds. So we kind of have a sense of a bit of a physical presence as well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah,
And I
I
totally
Okay.
understand.
have to just quickly introduce the people in the lab, but maybe Sid, do you want to tell him what this whole lecture series is about, and then I'll introduce the people in the lab. Maybe usually Arnon, Kripa gives an introduction. Kripa is the one who's moderating the whole thing. She gives an introduction to the speaker, and
No, not
then
for this one. This one
Sid thing. So sometimes Sid gives the introduction, but I'll be happy to give you an overview of who are all basically attending the talk. Sid, do you want to introduce Arnon first, and then we'll introduce the members of the lab?
Okay, sure. First of all, Arnon Zangvil. And I was thinking about it today. First of all, we're in for a treat. And I was thinking this morning, what is it that I really know about Arnon? In terms of his pedigree, the things you often talk about, which university he went to, and things of that nature. And the truth is, the only thing I really know about that part is that when he was a youngster, he was at the University of Illinois. Arnon is an Israeli born in Israel. And his father was probably an academic. And so he was at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And he was among the youngsters who were learning from, I think it's the first educational program using computers called Plato. And he was one of them. And he has a proclivity and great talent in the area of computer sciences at a time when computer sciences were just taking off. That's how I know Arnon, not from his academic work. He and I hang out at the same coffee shop. And we've known each other for probably about 4 or 5 years. And as you'll see, he is one of the most delightful people, sensitive, super smart. And what he just asked right now is Arnon par excellence. He didn't want to just talk without having a sense of who he was talking to and possibly seeing the people as well. You'll probably notice that very few people actually make that kind of a request. They can just go off and do it. And Arnon has an enormous sensitivity towards other people. And I've told him, for me, one of the real finds of moving into the neighborhood where I live 4 or 5 years ago was going to the coffee shop. And there was Arnon. And I don't know how we started talking, but we did. And since then, we haven't stopped talking. And you'll find in him, I'm sure, an extremely serious person with a great sense of humor, and somebody who has warmth of character and concern about other people, not just the work that he's doing, but why he's doing what he's doing. And being somebody in computers, he has become interested in and committed to issues around what the computer systems are wreaking in our lives. And because he's somebody with a social conscience, he's concerned about that. And all of you have read the article that he sent, and he's within the group of people who take these issues about human beings and their lives with this technology very, very seriously. So, Arno, thank you for accepting to be part of this. And it'll be the first time I'll hear you giving a lecture. All the time we're sipping coffee, talking about who knows what.
Thank you so much, Sid, for these very kind words. Too kind, I'm afraid, as I feel like I can only fail these high expectations, but I will do my best to present something interesting. And thanks so much.
And I would say that I've had the good fortune of meeting Arnon a couple of times, and I agree with everything that Sid said. So I think the audience is in for a real treat, and I love the article I said about what you sent. Just to introduce the group that is listening to you, Arnon, I don't know how much, I think we talked briefly about the work that we were doing here at AMMACHI Labs when we met, and Sid's role over here. So we basically in two main areas. One is technology and social sciences, and you will find that this group has an extreme from technology all the way to pure social sciences and all shades in between. And so the most common technology that we use, of course, is ICT. And so we use a lot of mobile and computer-based this thing. And we're in the skill development area, so mostly on empowerment, skill development, a little bit here and there in robotics. So you have people from the group that are working using ICTs in rural India for skill development and for general empowerment, sustainable development. And then you have people, hardcore social sciences, who are basically looking at the technology to see how best to implement it, how to reduce vulnerabilities, maximize empowerment, those kind of issues. And so you have people who are engineers, you have a lot of PhD students. Many of the people who are listening to you are PhD students. Some of them have recently joined for a PhD in sustainable development, and they're all probably either looking into technology skill development area, or they're looking into women's issues and women empowerment issues. And that's the group of this thing. But there are also people from the data sciences, there are people in robotics, on the technology side in the group. It's just generally what the group is about. So yeah, psychology, mental health, physical health, what else? Economics, water, education,
drones.
yeah. This is a group. It's an eclectic group, but they will all be very, very happy to hear what you have to say, and looking forward to that.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Is the presentation up?
Yeah.
Sorry about the learning curve with Microsoft Meet here. It's not my go-to conference system. Because you may be able to see it, but I can't see it, so I can't yet run it. One moment. Okay. So, and now you can see the second slide, and hopefully this will be my last technical question.
Disappeared somehow.
Yeah, we see you. We don't see the slide.
Oh. Quickly.
We saw it a short while ago and then it came off. So whatever you undid, just redo it.
Okay.
Okay, it's on.
Okay. So what I'd like to do, and I think we have about 40 minutes of a talk and then an open discussion, correct?
Right. And if you want people to ask in the middle, if that's what we would like, we can do that as well. But it's your choice.
So I prefer that you stop me if I don't make sense at some point, or if there's an important question that you feel is important to you and or to others, please stop me. Otherwise, we can leave the more leave most of the questions hopefully for the end. But definitely stop me if I go astray and or something is unclear. Briefly, want to go over my background because it's relevant. It's relevant, I think, because it has set me on the path that I'm on in terms of technology and thinking about technology. And as Sid said, just briefly, I grew up in both Japan, Germany, the US, and Israel. And an important part of my younger life was at this campus town in the middle of the cornfields and soybean fields of the Midwest of the US. I was very lucky to have really next door to my high school a building where the world's first multi-user system was developed. This is a quick screenshot of the terminals we're using at the time. I was a kid, but the doors were open 24/7 and we could just go in there. And at some point, the university staff realized that we were highly motivated kids and started using us also for programming and testing. And we kind of became, to some extent, part of this project. It's called the Plato system. The interesting thing that has influenced me greatly was that basically in the 1980s of the last century, I got a glimpse of things that we all take for granted today. Back then, we were already using chat and mail, and the screens are touch screens and they're graphic, and we were doing forums and programming multi-user systems. The original motivation for the system comes from the world of education. This was designed to mass educate for the US population in the minds of the people who envisioned and built this system. That's hence the little image of Sputnik in the back. That was a strong motivation. These are the last years of the Cold War. So that was the primary motivation, but the end result was pretty much kind of a pre-internet system that included most of what we see today on the internet, but about 20, 30 years before the internet showed up. These are how the screens looked. Interestingly, as a kid, when you see something like this, or at least for me, it's very obvious without requiring too much thought that this is how things are gonna materialize, because it just felt very natural. It was inherently social. I had friends on these systems in Hawaii and other campuses. It was an immensely creative environment. As I said before, always open to anybody walking through the door, no matter who they are, and trying to contribute and trying to become part of this thing that was developing there at this university town. So I was very lucky to be exposed to that, and I think that has kind of set me on the path that I took later on in my life. And just very quickly, I want to go through some of the key milestones of things that I've been doing over the last 3 decades or so. In the 90s, I was doing internet mail as internet was just entering the world of PCs, and I developed one of the world's first email packages for the PC back when these systems were still closed. Mail was not something that you could send to anyone at that point. If you were using one mail system, you couldn't send it to a user on another mail system. So the internet was changing that. And then I went into the world of internet security very naturally, again, because as some of you may know, the internet protocol initially wasn't encrypted. SMTP, the protocol for sending mail, was originally out of a rush to get it out there, was something that didn't include encryption. So mail was open, and then I went into that side of the world of technology, dealing with encryption, and at some point dealing with the security in cyber today. And over the last 20 years or so, I've been spending time around the medical space, and these are some of the screenshots of products I've designed and was part of. I don't want to dwell on this, but I just wanted to quickly provide a bit of a background of where I'm coming from to this talk. Over the last roughly 10 years or so, I've been thinking more about social media, also a very natural path for me. And to some extent, I feel that I kind of grew up together with the internet and with its challenges. And so this challenge of understanding social media from a broader perspective, and not just thinking about it in terms of a founder or a technologist or a developer, I think naturally that has drawn my attention over the last years, and I've tried to expand my horizons and my knowledge base to kind of deal with this challenge, to be able to properly understand it. And I've put up a slide which is a bit of a laundry list of perhaps some of the underlying forces that have shaped today's social media. And I think many of these today, if we were talking about this 5 years ago, I think many of these items would have required kind of a deeper discussion. I think most of these are kind of familiar to most of us, and even to a lot of the mainstream population today, as these problems have been growing over the last several years, and especially the last 2-3 years. And so, but I just want to briefly touch on a few and then focus on the issue of scale, which I think is kind of inherent to this whole challenge. So just quickly thinking about Facebook and how it originated, and the original DNA of Facebook, stealing data off of the Harvard servers to compare women and rate them, started to someone may argue dramatically the core. This, of course, has to do with the context in which these systems were systems, the finance world, which creates a certain kind of motivation, the underlying ideologies of the people involved, and also, of course, the government context, the regulatory context, or the lack of regulatory context in the case of the US over the last 30 years or so. And what we often think about and hear about is the business model, of course, and how the business model itself is potentially inherently abusive towards the users. Maybe this is a point to just dwell on for a few seconds. In a more conventional business model, when I develop a product, I think of my users and I try to serve my users the best way possible. And of course, these internet models, these so-called two-sided business models, where I'm trying to serve two types of users in parallel, in this case, both the advertisers and the users, there's an inherent tension between these two types of users I'm trying to serve. And, you know, if we follow the logic of all the, then we can understand of us, the, in a sense, side effect revenue generation. Another way this has been is through the prism of surveillance. I want to get to kind of a broader point which underlies some of these other points as well, and it has to do with the fact that these systems are obviously systems.
Arnon?
Economy of systems.
Arnon?
Yes, sorry, Sid, please.
Yeah, there's something with your voice. Sometimes you wrote here about echo chambers. Sometimes there's kind of an echo or a distortion, and it could be because people have their cameras on. The thing which Kripa had mentioned before, that's because of the bandwidth, etc. It could be that's one of the problems. I don't know how you solve it, but on occasion you have a distortion of your voice, and we can hardly hear you.
So what do you suggest that we do? Should we turn the video off? And also, please stop me whenever I'm unclear. I don't want to go through anything where I'm not heard. So please stop me as you just did. And should we turn video off for the purpose of getting a better quality of audio?
Is it possible to do a share screen without the video? In which case, that may help.
I think so. Should I turn my video off?
Yeah, that might help. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Should I repeat the key points of this slide, or should I continue?
Actually, that would be really nice if you could just quickly go through it again, because I kind of only heard half the slide. There's a lot of breaks in between.
Okay, let me try again. And is the sound quality a little better now, or better?
Yeah, now it's fine.
Okay, good. So I kind of ran through these various points, focusing on just a few. Let me see. Let me pick perhaps 2 or 3 which are critical. I think we all know about the underlying business model of social media. To some extent, I think all of us have an understanding of how it was born within a very specific US cultural and political context, and how that has, in a sense, shaped what it is today. The world of finance, which also has been a key shaping factor in how these systems have been designed and built, in terms of the revenue that they need to generate, in terms of the growth that they need to sustain, in terms of the size that they need to reach, etc. And a key point that I wanted to focus on, which is the last line in this slide, has to do with scale and the kind of inherent contradiction that there's between a company that desires to create a platform to as many users as possible with as operational efficiency as possible to reach profitability, at the same time is trying to serve a very highly diverse set of needs. Obviously, geography, each culture, each community has their own very needs, and I think this is kind of a key contradiction, or a key factor that has amplified many of the problems that are in this slide. And that's what I want us to just kind of keep in our head for a moment as we think about this. Now I'm going to jump into thinking for a moment about some of the underlying organizing principles of, I'm using terminology from one called Yochai Benkner, which is a scholar from Harvard University who thinks a lot about the network effect and speaks about the digital from an economic perspective. Identifies primary data production is organized, and social media is a type of this kind of a system. The 2 first ones are kind of obvious. A market-driven approach where we let a market set a value or use a market to allocate resources, a model we're all very familiar with. And of course, we're all familiar with a more centralized model, whether it's a government, or it could be a powerful multinational where the rules are set from the top. But the third model, and that's the one I'll focus on for the next few slides, is the commons model. I'm not sure you're all familiar with the term, but it's a different model in which free association really allows people to work together to produce value of some kind. And each of these organizing principles can be viewed from both. We can look at them from the technical perspective in terms of how decisions are made. We can look at these organizing principles from the power perspective in terms of who holds the power. But we can also, and I think it's important to recall that each of these models also is based on a certain set of thoughts in terms of who we are as people, the underlying ideology of these principles. And the market principle, as we all know, is based on the idea that as humans, we thrive in a world of competition where we try to do best. And I want to quickly halt just to make sure that you can hear me okay, that the audio quality is still fine. Am I audible still, or are we getting more network problems?
There were a couple of moments where the problem returned, but it's fine now.
Okay.
Are you getting closer and further away from the computer when you're speaking, or it might be just
No, I don't think. I think it's a bandwidth issue. So there are times when it's completely fine, and there are times when it's not. There's no way for us to predict.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying not to move, and I'm trying to speak relatively slowly and clearly. And I have
No,
two.
go ahead. Don't worry about it.
And I have two internet service providers connected to a load balancer. I'm really doing my best here from the technical perspective as well. But tell me if I'm unclear again, so I can at least repeat something that's important if that happens.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So we're all familiar with the market principle, where we assume that humans are basically in competition with one another. The commons model assumes and kind of relies on our other sides of our personality, where social exchange and reciprocity and just a less competitive mindset of social production is assumed in terms of who we are. And just to quickly, maybe this slide in terms of why markets aren't good for anything. Perhaps this is more relevant for a US audience, but just quickly in terms of where we're at economically, stagnation since the 80s, gross inequality. I think all of us are familiar with these outcomes that have stemmed from the, in a sense, overusage of markets to solve many problems which require at least other interventions or other principles, other organizing principles as well. And I wanna focus on the commons and just recall for us something that some of us who have grown with the internet know quite well, but big parts of the internet were actually developed using a commons model, and this includes the internet protocols themselves, TCP and IP, UDP, SMTP, and all the protocol stack itself is something that was designed in a process that was a free association process. Anybody could join. There was no fee required. All the protocols are referred to as RFCs, which is an acronym for request for comment, because this is how they were designed. So just to quickly recall that big parts of the internet were actually designed in a commons model, and not that it was an isolated model that didn't work within the frameworks of power dynamics and a market environment and some centralized control, but the key organizing principle of many of these products, in a sense, or protocols in this case, that were developed were not leveraging neither the market model nor the centralized control model. This goes for mail as well, SMTP, the simple mail transfer protocol. Also, in terms of encryption was in the 90s in the US was formally categorized as munitions in the same category as a Stinger missile. Export of hard encryption was forbidden under a law. This picture here is a picture on the bottom right is a picture of Phil Zimmerman, who invented PGP, Pretty Good Privacy. Pretty Good Privacy is one of the first public instances of encryption. The short story here is that it's the basis, to some extent, of encryption that we have today in the internet, all across the internet. The way it was spread to the world is that Phil actually wrote a book that included source code of all the code for hard encryption, and using free speech published it under MIT Press to the rest of the world and bypassed the export restrictions. He was still sued by the US government and spent several years fighting off various lawsuits, successfully at the end. But this is just a brief history of how encryption, which was also, in this case, spread in a very bizarre way, and not through a market mechanism, or definitely not through a centralized control mechanism, which was trying to stop this from happening. And this paved the way for modern internet security, which we have incorporated in every connection through a browser, or any kind of encrypted system that we use today. The world of free and open software, I'm sure, is familiar to all of us. Back in the 90s, the thought that an open source operating system would be the leading operating system around the planet, to many people seemed very ridiculous. But as we know, this has happened, and also this has happened through a form of free association or commons. Some examples of failed attempts. For example, messaging. Unlike email, where we take for granted today, where we can send a message from one person to another, in the world of messaging, this hasn't happened, and we have different protocols that different vendors use and have closed off their system, kind of similar to where email was back in the 80s. So if I use Skype, I can't necessarily communicate via an instant message to a Facebook Messenger user. The history of how that has happened is a little interesting. I won't dwell on it for long, but I just want to bring this up as an example of how these various models of commons and centralized control and a market organizing principle often compete with one another, and the tension between these models may determine the end result. In this case, the end result is that we don't have interoperability between these various systems, and a market model has won over, and therefore I think us as users have lost something. So why are these commons-based initiatives interesting? For one thing, in the world of software and also in social media today, these protocols still exist and are the underlying layers of everything that's going on. So these protocols, in a sense, carve out the digital space and set the rules for how systems cooperate with one another. Perhaps we can kind of think and take for granted the fact that every machine around the planet has an IP address and communicates via TCP/IP to other machines, but maybe we shouldn't take that for granted as much, and imagine a world where a market environment would have forced different sets of devices to speak one language, and other devices would have spoken another language, similarly to where the world, if some of you remember, the world of media was, in terms of the wars between VHS and I think the other protocol was Sony Beta or something like that. What if the world of TCP/IP looked like that? Obviously, we wouldn't have anything that we have today in terms of the internet or social media or anything else. So the tension between these principles, and this is kind of the groundwork I want to lay out as we think about where can go here on forward.
Arnon?
I want to quick just ask if
Arnon, could you say the last thought again? It just all of a sudden faded out for several seconds.
Of course. So what I want to do is kind of lay the groundwork for thinking about how social media can be organized in a different way than it is today. And the examples that we've seen in terms of key building blocks of the internet that were developed using, amongst other models, the Commons model, is something that I wanted to lay out and have kind of in our mind as we think about how social media can look in the future. I think that's the key point of this slide. And with that, I'd like to move on into thinking about specifically social media. I've made a distinction here between the concept of identity and a social circle. And I want us to think about that as we think about social media, and to try to think about social media in terms of layers. Now, for us in the software world, it's a very kind of a natural way to think about systems. When we, for example, create some kind of an architecture slide about a system, we draw out these various layers. We think about the lower layers as providing kind of broad functionality and the top layers providing very specific functionality. So if we think about social media in these terms, we can recognize at the bottom layer is the layer of identity. This is where, for example, when I log into a Facebook account or Twitter account, I use my username and password, I somehow identify myself. And from that point on forward, things get more specific, more complicated. So the lower layer is this layer of who we are. Today, when we think about these systems as users, we kind of miss this little layer of identity, because all that happens is that we get a very small login screen, or by now it's probably automated when we're always logged in, but we just identify ourselves with the set of credentials, a username and a password. Interestingly, in the 2000s, about 15 years ago, there was a lot of activity thinking about, I have this pop-up about bad network quality again, so I'm pausing. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay.
So this layer of the identity actually has an interesting history to it, and a set of protocols that were developed with a very different vision in mind. The different vision was a vision in which the identity, our digital identity, is actually something that is completely separate from a specific service, such as a Twitter or a Facebook or a Google, where the identity is something that us as end users actually manage. And a whole set of protocols and a whole concept of how identity is actually created and managed on the internet was designed. The modern protocols used today in the internet are actually based on those, but have been hijacked by the private vendors to only serve their specific needs. The remnant that we can see of this is when we, for example, log into a website, we are sometimes allowed to log in using some other credentials, right? For example, when I log into a proprietary website, that website may offer me to log in using my Google credentials, right? When we all have seen that, I think, as users. This is actually a remnant of a set of protocols called Federated Identity Protocols, which were designed a while back with a very different vision in mind. And that vision was a vision in which we as users own our identity, and actually, on top of that, also own a set of tools to manage how our identity, and very importantly, how the data that is related to this identity can actually be used by other providers. So for example, imagine a world in which instead of using Facebook to manage my privacy settings, I actually use a different provider focused on me, on my security, where I can specify, using hopefully a nice and easy to use interface, how my identity can be used and what kind of usage I allow other providers to do with the data that I create. This was the vision of federated identity, and the protocols are still in place, but just used in a very limited way. I want to pause and just make sure that this concept of the federated identity makes some sense or any sense, or ask if there's questions about how this alternate vision may play out.
So I have a question. So are you saying that it is better for us to use, and this has come, and you said it's comes up so many times, log in with your Google ID or with your Facebook ID, and I always choose not to because I just am afraid to give Facebook or Google more information about myself by doing that. So you're saying actually it's a better thing for us to allow our Google and Facebook IDs to log into other websites? Is that my takeaway from here?
That wouldn't be my takeaway. And the reason is that in today's world, the only vendors that have become a de facto providers of identity are these huge vendors. In this alternate vision of how this could work, there would be a whole set of other vendors that would be competing between one another, and competing only for the sake of trying to provide us users a good identity service and a good privacy management service. So instead of Google being so on that list, when you just asked about, that list of login using some other vendor, instead of having the huge vendors sit there, the same vendors that also provide us with the actual service that we're getting, there would be other providers on that list. And those providers would be a whole other set of providers that only focus on us and on our privacy and on our identity. For example, I think some of you or may recall these attempts by the vendors to create something called the Microsoft Passport, for example. These were attempts to create an actual service separate from the other services. So it would be separate from the Google search and separate from YouTube and separate from Facebook. It would just be a service focused on us. And that service would just kind of be a service that provide us with a secure identity and our ability to manage a set of rules about how about how services actually provide us the various services that we use and how the data that we generate within those services is used. So yes, it would be a world in which we can use another identity provider, but it wouldn't be the big vendors. It would be alternative vendors focused on us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I don't see why those other vendors could not become giants on their own just because they own the identity and privacy of everybody else.
True.
But that's
in today's world. Very true.
Just a thought.
Very true. And I think that the only way, just to quickly answer that, and I think that without some form of regulation that actually identifies privacy, similarly to GDPR in Europe, for example, without some form of regulation that actually identifies this segment of the digital world as something that needs to be contained and separate from the vendors, then it wouldn't happen. And I think that's, you're touching on the actual reality of why it hasn't happened. And in terms of understanding, maybe thinking about how it could happen, I think we're going to get to that quickly. Just to build off this concept of the identity commons, the next natural layer in this utopian world, and I agree, we can't see how it can just materialize today in today's market forces. I want to get to how it can materialize in the next few slides, but just bear with me. In this utopian world where our identity and our ability to manage our privacy is actually managed by some other vendor focused on us, the next logical layer to think about is our social circle. And when I say social circle, I'm simply referring to the set of contacts, the people that I have relationships with, in this case, digital relationships. As a reference to kind of make this point quickly and clearly, in the world of mobile communication, the my set of contacts are obviously my contacts. If I exchange a phone and use a different vendor, then still my contact list, I can port it over to this new phone, and I own my social circle. And in the world of our digital platforms today, we know that we don't really own our social circle. The set of social relations within Facebook, even though now through GDPR, if we're in Europe, we can export those, the data that represents these relations, our ability to really own these relations and control them is not there. And now I want to get to this alternate vision and start describing what is actually happening in the world over the last several years as an alternative to the main social media platforms that we're familiar with. So just to quickly ask, how many of you are familiar with diaspora or Mastodon, or what is referred to as the Fediverse or the Federation, or this other world of services that are built on different principles? Is this something that some of us have been exposed to?
I don't know any of this. Maybe the techies, I don't know. I've never heard of anything that's over here.
Okay. So there is this alternate world, and it actually contains by now several million users. It's been growing slowly over the last several years, and perhaps growing a little stronger over the last 2 or 3 years. But it's a world of alternative services which are based on somewhat different principles. And I want to stay with this slide for a few minutes to kind of hold a discussion on how this alternative reality can look like, and how parts of it are already manifested in the world today. So in this alternative vision, there are a set of protocols developed under the Commons principle, of course, that allow a set of different vendors and different developers to develop services that serve very specific needs of specific users. But unlike the big vendors, these various services, even though they're very different and unique from one another, adhere to a set of protocols that allow them to communicate with one another, and hence this world federation. This concept of the federation, we can think about it for identity, as I just mentioned in the previous slides. But in terms of social media, the way that this works is as follows. There is a protocol, for example, this protocol mentioned at the bottom of the slide. And this protocol allows any sort of a service to report a set of activities to another service. So for example, when I'm using a social media user interface using the Fediverse or the Federation, even though I get my usual perhaps news feed, or I can see a set of tweets or some other forms of interaction, which in terms of our end user familiarity will be quite familiar to us, what happens behind the scenes is actually very different. We're going to be using, instead of using some huge provider's service like a Facebook or a YouTube or a Twitter, we're going to be using something very modest. It could be a server that only supports 300 users, and the decisions within that server can be done in various ways. It can be done top down through some manager. It can be a more democratic process where people have discussions to set the rules for themselves. And so at the local level, and this touches on the issue of scale that we mentioned before, at the local level, we can set our own rules. And we can, for example, determine how we want to moderate content in our specific geography, in our specific culture, in our specific time. For example, during these Corona times, trying to somehow deal with a set of conspiracy theories or things, that are flooding our news feeds today. We may set our own rules, and more importantly, as humans, use our own set of abilities to create an environment which is an environment that works for us, but instead of this feudalist approach where each environment is separate from the other environments, the proposal of this federation or the Fediverse, and when I speak about these millions of users, I'm speaking about roughly 4+ million users who are presently on these systems, but they all communicate with one another. The end effect is that content that I generate on. Yes, please, Sid.
Could you say what those numbers are again? You suddenly went out for a second.
Of course. Yes, of course. So the number of users, estimated number of users from within the last year is 4 million+ users who are currently using these systems. And these 4 million users have visibility into each other's activities and into each other's content. So to that extent, it behaves as though we're on a social network that's broad and behaves similarly to some extent as today's social networks. But importantly, actually it's constituted by a set of small service providers and set of communities that each determine their own rules. For example, one of these systems is called Mastodon. Mastodon is basically an instance, a server that I can bring up. You guys can bring it up as well. Any community that wants to create social media that works for them their own way can bring up a server somewhere. They can host it, they can run it locally, they can put it on a cloud provider or a hosting service. We can bring this server up together. We can hold a meeting to determine what are the ways that we want to use this system. We'll need some technical capabilities for sure. So some of us will need to be developers. So I could be the developer and I could work with some of the other technical people within the group, but most of the group could be non-technical and basically be involved in a process where our needs are discussed and our design becomes more collaborative. And even though for a moment this sounds like something very perhaps post-apocalyptic and limited in terms of being closed off in its own universe, it's not. It's something that actually relying on these federated architecture protocols provides us both the breadth of being able to communicate with other people in other instances, in other areas of the world, and at the same time provides us with this localization. So it almost sounds too good to be true, but there is a big catch. There is a huge catch, which I also on by the question regarding why isn't this being materialized today? Why wouldn't the big vendors just eat all this up? But before I move on to the big catch, I just want to quickly stop and check a couple of things. One, first I want to check if I was clear enough in the way I explained this, and to get some questions, some clarifying questions to make sure that the point is clear. And also I want to ask about time and how much time I still have, if I have any.
Yeah, Arnon, I have a question, and that is, I'm trying to formulate it. I think one of the problems that many people feel, but that's maybe I'm the only one who feels it, and that is issues of privacy. And I resent big companies having data about me that I may want them to have, but I also may not want them to have, and I have no way of controlling what it is that they can pull off of whatever it is that I'm doing, writing to people, content of what I'm writing, things of that nature. So is what you're suggesting a layer a layer of control that individuals have or small groups have that can defend themselves from these big companies that learn about us, things that we might not want them to know, and then exploit that information. Is this a layer where people decide who gets the information, what information it is that we want them, we individuals, you and me and Bhavani and Sur, Gayatri, all these people, that we make decisions about what we allow to be available to other people, with the possibility of pulling back and saying, oh, I thought X, but now I don't want X. So is this a layer that you're adding on to the already existing system where there's more control by individuals or by small groups, or not necessarily small groups? Time-wise, how about another, let's see, it's 10:30, no. How about another 10 minutes max? Is that possible?
Just could you repeat the last sentence? How about, you faded out for a second there.
How about 10 minutes max
okay.
for the presentation?
Okay. So, and then we have time for more questions?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of clarifications. This world that I'm describing is not so much an add-on on top of the existing vendors. It's a pretty much replacement world to the existing vendors. So these are systems that stand on their own 2 feet and provide these services. In terms of privacy, when I speak of us setting our own rules, then yes, definitely one of the key issues that we want to address when we set these rules is the issue of who's going to gain access to our content and under what terms. So, for example, when I post something to our group, I can set a setting. I can using these kind of systems, I can set a checkbox that specifies that this content will never leave our specific server or our specific group or what have you. And unlike the case of the large vendors, where when you're doing that, you're really preventing your content from being visible to other users, but vendors can still see everybody's content. In the case of this federated universe, the content is actually is invisible to anyone but us, because we have our system, we own our system, we manage it, and privacy is not some logical construct or some desire. It becomes a fact because we actually set these rules, and because we also have control of the underlying technology, then we are guaranteed that this privacy is truly maintained. So does that answer the question, Sid?
Yes, it does. And I wasn't thinking of it as a standalone. I thought of it as being integrated with the systems that already exist. And you're talking about an alternative conceptual system of social communication. Kind of like what we have when we talk to each other without computers. You have groups, small groups. You have special signs. The greetings. You move your hands in certain ways, and then you're part of the same group. And then you're committed to keeping whatever information there is within the group. That the Druze religion doesn't allow anybody to pass out information to anybody else except other Druze about the religion. There was a time if you did it, you could have been killed for doing that. And so it's like keeping systems, something that we do as human beings without computers, way before there were computers. People are already doing this. And in part, you're saying, let's take the computer system let's take this digital system and have it reflect what it is that people do in any case, but now with digital. Somebody just wrote to me asking if you could continue beyond the 10 minutes. So the answer is absolutely. So the limit is basically for you, and anybody who has to leave, you should leave, of course. You don't have to ask permission or something like that. Okay.
So Sid, I want to expand on your comment now and to kind of drive the point in terms of how this world balances the needs of specific communities and at the same time also may provide a public space and a broad space and a global space. So true, when we think of privacy, we may envision communities that may desire to remain very closed off to the world, and that's definitely a use case that these systems may support. However, the vision doesn't, the vision that the people involved with these systems are pursuing is not a vision of these various closed communities, even though these scenarios can be supported. The vision is a vision in which we have local control and we can set our own local rules, but we do use these protocols to communicate with these other islands to create a whole continent. So for example, we can think today the large vendors don't support these protocols because they're huge and they don't need to deal with these smaller vendors of these few million users. So the way it works today is that there are many dozens of these servers around the world, each of which can in some way provide very localized services to its own community, but it also communicates with the whole set of other servers under some set of rules and provides a limited visibility perhaps into the content of the rest of the world. So we are trying, and that's why when we looked at social media and we kind of tried to analyze some of the key factors that have taken social media, today's social media, to the place that it is reached, then this issue of negotiating with the global is a key issue, and the protocols and the vision proposed here is a vision which is definitely possible and desirable even, because some problems we need to solve at a large scale, and some problems we need to solve at a large scale, and some problems we need to solve at a medium scale, perhaps at the level of the city, or the level of a neighborhood, or the level of a specific expert association that specializes in something in the world. So the overall vision is a vision in which we try to negotiate the local with the broad, the local with the global, through these various protocols. And I think it's a very convincing, the several million users that use these systems today, and I'm one of them, I think it's a very convincing vision. I didn't touch it on kind of the limitation, but I want, before I get into the limitation, and the limitation has to do with innovation and growth and the underlying economy of all this. But before we get into that, I want to just pause again and see if we can collect more questions, just to ensure that what I'm speaking of here, just to make sure that I'm explaining this clearly enough, because I'm not sure I am. So I want to pause for questions before we move on.
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me? This is Sophia. Arnon, can you hear me?
I can hear you well, Sophia. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So did I understand correctly that, like, for example, if somebody has diaspora and somebody has Mastodon, can they actually like message each other or not? Or you have to be like, it has to be overlapping with, what is it, Friendica? Because the reason why I'm asking, like, for example, I know somebody who uses Telegram or instead of WhatsApp, And she asked me to also use Telegram, but then I said no because I don't want to download another app on my phone. And everybody else is using WhatsApp, so it doesn't seem very practical to have a different app for different kinds of groups of people. And then, I mean, okay, is that clear, my question?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is yes and no, because and as this slide specifically tries to visualize, because this is a very dynamic world and the protocols are very much in motion, and these various initiatives are, to some extent there is strong cooperation and to some extent there is healthy competition, but there is a strong drive to try to reach interoperability amongst all these systems, and therefore the three services mentioned shown in the center actually support this. If you're part of this center, then you're going to be able to speak to the rest of the world, to the multicolor world, because it means that you're running a service that supports all the various protocols. And that's the intention. So you're right. The intention is to try to reach a point where there is broad interoperability, so that as a user you won't have to think about whether Telegram interoperates with Signal or interoperable with Messenger, etc. It's still a world in motion, but happily there are some services already that do support the various protocols, and then as a user provide you with one service that you can use to gain these advantages that we talked about, both the local control and the global access. So Friendica, Hubzilla, and PostActive are examples of those. And there's work across these, so Diaspora is doing work to connect with Mastodon and vice versa. There is work all across these groups to reach this interoperability, but it's work in progress, and some of the vendors are there and some are still in motion.
There's some other hands up. So, Bhavani?
No, I'll wait till the end. I'll wait till the end. I have questions, but I'll wait till the end. It's better. I'd like to hear him out completely.
Okay, so Arnon, what do you want to do? There's some people who have questions, and
yeah, let's take more questions, please.
Okay, Gayatri.
So thank you. It has been, I can't say I understood everything of what you presented, but I more or less understood what you were saying. And my question is, these services like Facebook or WhatsApp or everything, they are pretty much free services, in the sense we don't pay anything for the services. Yes, they are from big, big houses, and they have, the security issues and all that. But for a common person, a lay person who is not really familiar about all these things, about AI and all these things that they are doing and using the data and things like that, why would they want, how will this other alternate system gain momentum? Why would people want to move? The number of people who really understand this problem are going to be only the few, probably, the elite, well-educated, who understand these issues, right? So the thing is that social media, in order to succeed, or as I understand it, needs a wide user base. Otherwise, people will not want to be part of that particular network or that particular, there is no incentive. So I am not sure how, without getting that scale, how will this system work? And I see the benefits of the system, and personally, I would like to be part of this system, but I don't think I can convince my mom, who really doesn't understand all these things, to really, try it out or even consider it. So I was just wondering how is this going to, how will the future for such a system be?
That's a great question, and I think I agree with the assumptions that you make in terms of what's needed for broad mainstream appeal. And it's no coincidence that these commercial vendors have more than 2 billion users, and all these these services combined, these federations only have several million. So I think there's a few. I think you're touching on kind of the next point that I wanted to talk about, which has to do with the economic viability of these ecosystems. But before I get to that, I want to also mention that if we do kind of a rough calculation of how much we'd have to pay, for example, if I would try to encourage my mom to use this system, and the only thing that assuming these systems make their way and become friendly enough and simple enough, and there's people who manage them and everything else. And let's assume my mother has a sensibility to the issue of privacy, and she has an interest in using these alternative networks. If the yearly cost is roughly $4, for example, instead of using an advertising-based model, then maybe that's something that has value on its own. I don't think necessarily that this is the answer, the full answer to your question. I don't think it's the real answer to the question of how these ecosystems can reach the broad population, because in order to do that, they need to become economically powerful and viable. But I just want to remind ourselves as users that maybe we got used to this idea of free services, and maybe it's not really in our interest, even though this is, maybe this is what we got used to because of the specific conditions that have created the world that we now are in terms of social media. But if I had to make a choice of paying $4 a year for using a non-ad-based system, maybe that's a viable choice for me. And the truth is that this whole federation world, that's its limitation and also its beauty. The people who are involved in most of this work are trying to create systems that are not based on ad revenue. Almost all of them exclusively are imagining a world where communication is something that we think of not as a commercial service, but we think of communication as a human construct that needs to be more within our control. So the first part to answer your question is, maybe there is value in thinking about social media as a non-ad based ecosystem. And this is the world that currently this federation and the Fediverse provide. For me also, I'm very aligned with this challenge in terms of trying to understand how this ecosystem can actually grow in terms of innovation and economic growth and actually become a viable alternative to the mainstream. And I think we don't have the time for a proper analysis of everything that needs to happen for that to take place. But there are some good, interesting signs out there of things that are happening that are taking us in that direction. And I can give two examples. One is this issue of interoperability. Before the European GDPR, before this directive came into action in 2018, and to some of us who don't know what that is, it's a privacy directive that provides us with basic privacy rights within the digital realm. Before this came into effect, we had very little control. For example, we couldn't even download our data from Facebook. And now we can, and we're actually allowed to do that. We can receive a digital file in some digital machine-readable format that can allow us to take this data and move it to another provider. So what I'm trying to say with this example is that the world of government regulation has a lot to say in terms of steering this future. And just as an example, if GDPR would go just a tiny step forward and request not just portability, but actually demand interoperability between these vendors, then a different world would have been created in terms of competition between commercial vendors that would allow commercial vendors to actually compete also on the grounds of privacy control and things of that nature. So part of the answer has to do with other forces at play, including government regulation, that may that may steer this world in terms of how it's constructed in the future. And government regulation at a global scale is something that's actually very interesting to think about, because if we think about various countries actually setting their own rules, that becomes a very strong vulnerability for the global vendors that don't really know how to operate across diverse rules. So if we think about regulation, and Germany has been leading the pack here in terms of that, if we think about regulation that's actually diverse across the various geographies and countries, that creates a very challenging situation for the global vendors. So one way to think about it is perhaps this non-commercial world is growing, but at the same time, if some of the rules and some of the value that we can prove in this small world becomes something that we all understand. And I think today, for example, 5 years ago, we didn't understand the pitfalls of privacy. Today we do. 3 years ago, before 2016, many Americans didn't understand the effect of these platforms on politics. Today they do. So as people become more aware of the pitfalls, I think regulation is going to step up and force these vendors to behave in a less global fashion, where they themselves start to customize, in a sense, the service they provide to specific geographies. So they would be coming, in a sense, from where they're at now towards this more localized, federated vision. But I think the deeper question has to do with economic viability and innovation. And I don't think that the two models contradict each other at the core. I think this non-commercial model proves a point in terms of localization versus globalization, in terms of our ability as communities to have control over our services. And if we take that a step further, that would also mean, for example, that within our specific group, we could determine that we do allow commercial content under some conditions. For example, we wouldn't want it mixed in and confusing our political discussion or our social interaction of a certain kind. And similarly to how when we enter a store, we know that we're in a store and now we're buying products, we could also set these rules within these worlds in terms of how the world of commerce or advertising is integrated within these environments. So the key here is again this key of communities and more specific control at the local level. And I think if we take that a step further, then currently where this world of the federated services lies, then we could see also how we could locally start determining some of the roles that also affect our economic life, our commerce life, ad-based perhaps models or others. I mean, I know it's a big topic, so these are kind of, small answers to big topics, and I apologize for, the lack of time.
Speaking about the lack of time, why don't you continue, and we'll have questions at the end, so we can hear what it is, more about what it is that you're trying to say, and then we can have an open discussion.
I'm pretty much ready for the open discussion. The last point I wanted to make relates to this question that was asked, and what I started speaking of related, in terms of how these models can truly scale to become viable economically, thereby supporting growth and innovation as well. Where today there is a bit of a dichotomy. The people who are leading most of these efforts are viewing themselves as kind of an island, a non-commercial kind of an island. And I think there's a lot of value in how that's being done today. And the next step, and that's kind of my last point before the open discussion, is what we started talking about now. It relates to how this kind of a model can scale to also include different commercial models, economic models for the sustainability and viability of the actual infrastructure. So we're starting off with a model that says financially we're paying a few dollars a year for these services on our own because we don't yet know how to integrate the world of commerce, advertising, and market into these systems. But the next step is actually to do that, and that has to do also with what I mentioned previously in terms of regulation, in terms of public awareness to the various pitfalls. I think that when we start having more control over these environments, then we're gonna gain the confidence that we could actually set these rules. Today, we're in a position where these rules are dictated from above, and that's it. So I'd like to actually end with a small question, which I don't know the answer to, and maybe that can lead us off to an open discussion. So I'm wondering, in terms of typically the world of regulation has been looking at markets, and when it's especially in the US, and this is a big disclaimer for my whole talk, it's very US centric. I'm very aware of that and sorry that this is my limited worldview. But typically when thinking about markets, regulators think in terms of price, in terms of ensuring consumers the lowest possible price for the products that they buy to avoid monopolies and such. But in the world of the internet, where these two-sided business models provide us free services in exchange for ads, what is really the role of regulation? And I just want to end with this question. Would it make any sense for a regulatory body in a certain country to, for example, determine that within a certain market, if that market only is based on ad-based revenue model and there is no ability to purchase the service, then that market is in a sense, in some way, breaking the law? Would that be a reasonable regulatory proposal? So a market that doesn't allow a person to actually buy the service and forces them to buy the service through their data and in a sense becoming the product would not be a legal market. I would always have the opportunity, if I desired, similarly to software where I'm sure we've all seen this many times, right? We're offered an ad-based version, but there's the opportunity to also pay and turn that service into a non-ad-based service. Doesn't it make sense for any market, for any service, to offer that ability to allow us users to actually request that instead of using ads, we'd actually pay for the product? And I want to end there and open the discussion.
Okay, so because some people are going to have to leave, thank you, Arnon. There'll be a discussion. I want to say something before some people must leave. Thank you for a really interesting talk. Anybody who wants to hear more about it is invited to Jaffa in Israel, and you can join in on the conversations with Arnon and with Sur and with other people who come to that coffee shop. So thank you very much for presenting an alternate view of what is ubiquitous in our societies now. It's very, very enlightening. Okay, so now anybody who wants to take up the challenge of Arnon's question, or if they have other questions, why don't we begin with Vivek?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I had thank you, first of all, for a very informative talk, Dr. Moon. And I was just wondering while you were discussing all this, Wikipedia is a kind of a model where there are some things that are being audited, I would say, by some people who just want to contribute to that knowledge, correct? And it's kind of free, but it has a donation-based approach, right? Mm-hmm. So do you see interoperability? So for example, somebody logging into one of these new I would say data providing services, or not data providing, but providing means of communication, some social network based communication. All these services talking to each other, that can maybe it can be done by through some free people interested in creating this freeware of sorts where people talk to each other through that. The one thing that I'm understanding is there's not that much data that needs to be exchanged, just some basic stuff. And then you can connect between the two clients, if you will, or not clients, but different type of social network providers, right? So I don't know if, do you see this to be a very big problem, interoperability from that angle? That seems to me that there's not that much information to be provided. If I logged into one, if I had one service and trying to connect to the other, if there will be, and then all this doesn't have to go through somebody. It can be transparently, I mean, it can be managed without anybody knowing what is flowing through these different interfaces in these social media, I don't know what you call it, engines, or yeah. So regulation, is that really needed? That's my question. Or can freeware or free providers or people who want to do this come together to create this, just like Wikipedia, and then maybe it takes over because it takes off because there's enough, the basics have been solved, and then of course there can be so many providers, like you are already showing so many of them. Any thoughts on that? Just want to see what you think.
Yeah, I think those are great questions. I'm not sure I have super clear answers. I have some thoughts on these questions, though. Specifically in terms of the interoperability between the various services, it's a work in progress, but it's already working pretty well. So some of that is working well, but it's very early on in terms of this decision. There are some big kind of big challenges around the corner that are waiting to be addressed. So when I oversimplify and say that we can make decisions at the local level, that's true. And I oversimplify and say that we can interoperate at the global level, that's also true. But the reality is kind of a mixed reality in which once we interoperate between various services that have differing rules, then we will need to reach decisions across these various different sets of communities. And it makes sense that that's a challenge that's waiting for us, because if we want to govern a global system, then obviously that requires some form of global governance. So that's a quick comment regarding interoperability and how these systems work today. In terms of free and contribution versus and the Wikipedia model as a reference, I think that maybe the answer lies in the question of how we kind of view these services as a society. And if we look at some of these services as kind of core services that we want within our society that provide core or very foundational social values, then it would be, then I can see how for those types of services, we may definitely find the motivation to leverage non-ad-based models such as contribution, or perhaps cities could make some of these services available, or for perhaps in places where there are more functioning democracies versus the one I'm specifically in, a country could provide these types of services. So I think there's a variety of models that may work, and Wikipedia is definitely an inspiring model. But I do think that for some of the higher kind of for some of the other services which are within the realm of more of economic life as well, there we do need to figure out how we can we can finance these types of services at a global scale to also support a lot of innovation, which is still required in order to bring these services to a place where they're highly usable, easy to use, very friendly, etc. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your questions, but that's my kind of first pass attempt to speak to that.
No, thank you. I think
Okay.
I kind of understand your thought there. Thank you.
Okay, Bhavani.
Yeah. Arnon, I just wanted actually us as a group to reflect on what you've said and how it actually impacts our work, and whether principles that you have said are something that we should consider while we're looking at it. So we use a lot of the mobile applications that are there for our work that we use in the field in rural India. So Facebook is something that we use a lot. We use WhatsApp, Messenger, all kinds of communication software. Plus, we're building our own. So one of the things is that really alarmed me was that the article that you said about how it could actually really exacerbate vulnerabilities and actually create a not a fair world. And I think that's what is concerned. And that's what I would like you to maybe reflect on how is what you're proposing now, this parallel universe of communication and applications and internet, is that something that we should start looking into for the work that we're doing? If it is so, are there already existing replacement systems? Can we use another social media instead of Facebook? If so, what is that? Give us something concrete that we can actually use and apply. Now you have PhD students who are going to be doing work in the villages, and they will be using tools that are completely internet based. So what would your advice be on what we should be looking at in terms of what are the common swaps that we can do to support a more democratic internet?
Okay, so on the messaging side, the reality is that the messaging vendors today, there is some level of vulnerability there in terms of privacy, but it can be, for example, dealt with by using alternatives such as Signal in terms of the core messaging protocol itself. Signal, I'm not sure if everybody is familiar, but Signal is a more secure environment. The actual encryption protocol of Signal was licensed to Facebook and to Messenger and to Skype, so it's in use by some of the other vendors. But unlike the other vendors where the source is closed, Signal is open source, so it's continuously being audited and the security is continuously kept up to date at the highest possible level. So Signal is just an example of a highly secure, free messaging service that can be used. So that's a great alternative, but it's only for messaging. So it's great for that, but doesn't give you a serious answer to the question of using social media in general. In terms of using social media in general, the alternative that I've been using is called Mastodon. It's a server that works within this Fediverse that I've presented before. The problem with it is that it requires, at this stage, it still requires a bit of technical knowledge to set up, and for actual end users to use, it's not difficult to use. It's pretty straightforward, and the interface is quite similar to Twitter or some of the other services that we're used to. And it's a viable alternative. There are many servers popping up around the world that are using Mastodon to actually provide social media services for specific communities. And once you do that, then the rules of how the content is shared, both internally and via these federated protocols to other instances, is within your control. For example, you could decide that within some of the communities, all the content remains completely closed off, and then you have a strong guarantee that it's not going to reach some other server. It's not going to be sitting on some public service, that's in control and visible to a public vendor. So there are some actual alternatives. Diaspora is also a viable alternative, and there's more coming up and popping up, and they do interoperate with one another. So they are out there, and I think the key to truly adopting them is at this stage, unfortunately, is you do need some technical skill sets in-house to be able to set those up and manage those. But it does sound like you have those, so maybe for you specifically, it's a viable alternative. And I'd love to work with you on that. You know, if that's something that you guys are interested in doing at some point, then for me, this is something that I'm highly interested in, because I do think that this exact kind of work where specific communities identify their own needs and want to build their own form of social media, this is the world that I'm pursuing, and I want to see how my specific skill sets can be put in use to actually make that happen. So I'd be very interested to help also.
I don't want to take up other people's questions time, but the reason I'm asking is so that it can help not just one person, but it just helps also the work that we're trying to do. And so, for example, Yamuna, who's in this group, is starting to set up a group on Facebook to help women entrepreneurs. So she's setting up a closed group where people will share information that will help women's businesses. So by using a platform like Facebook, we can actually reach a lot more people. And these are all women who started their own businesses. They were impacted by COVID. We did a research on how we found out what their needs are. But if we then move to a platform which only has 4 million users, then it really risks, in terms of economic empowerment, then it is not, will it still work? Can information from this Mastodon then be pushed into Facebook through some other way, so that we still have the reach that we can get with Facebook, at the same time be secure? I don't know if I'm making sense, because I may not understand every aspect of this.
So no, it makes perfect sense, and I think that's you're touching on the key challenges of these systems and the current scale that they're operating at, and therefore the fact that they're, for some purposes, they're just less viable in terms of the visibility that they provide for content. Because once you're in the world of a market where you're trying to expose your content to an audience, then this is where the large platforms provide value, and this is where the small platforms don't yet provide substantial value. So I think if maybe the answer lies in an analysis of the audiences that you're trying to reach, because if those audiences are relatively well targeted, and these are people that you're already associated with and can also encourage to move into this type of a federated social media environment, then it's viable. But if it's a more broad audience where, in a sense, you're advertising a need or a service, or trying to locate someone within a broader world, then definitely Facebook is going to have a strong advantage. There are some specific tools that can be used to broadcast things that are happening within the Fediverse to Facebook, but because Facebook has control over this, it can't be done at large scale, because it very quickly breaks their license agreement. You can't use, for example, an automated tool to do these kind of posts at a large scale, because it breaks their license agreement, because they effectively want to keep you locked within their world. So there is a strong limitation there still. I think that's where in the future regulation and interoperability will kick in, but at this stage, there is still a big challenge there.
Okay, thank you. Deva or Diva, I always, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Ms. Temple.
Hi, Sid, it's Deva. Yes, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Arnon. So I've been really watching this field closely lately as an American, with the election coming up, and the recent release of the documentary on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, which I highly suggest for anyone who hasn't had an opportunity to see it yet, it really shed light and helped me understand some of the dynamics in terms of what the Facebook algorithm does to sort of silo us into different political worlds and to divide us, which has made our politics alarmingly volatile. Actually, I feel that my country is on the precipice of a civil war, to be very honest. And then I also recently watched the film, another documentary called The Great Hack, which is about Cambridge Analytica and its impact on elections, not just here in the United States, but worldwide. And so I've become increasingly aware of and concerned with the negative impacts of social media. And more than a decade ago, I was asked to write a chapter in a 3-volume anthology on peace movements worldwide. And I was sort of tapped because I was a young researcher at the time, and they wanted someone that was sort of a millennial. I'm technically the end of Gen X, but sort of more of a millennial to speak to the power of Web 2.0 or social networking to sort of foster peace movements. And our anthology was published the same month that the Arab Spring began. And many of the recommendations that I made for how social media could have been used to create peaceful change movements was being implemented. In fact, what I never foresaw, of course, was I didn't foresee what would happen with Syria and Russia and all of the geopolitical stuff that has resulted. And I also didn't see what would happen with the sort of propaganda machine that's taken over the internet. And so I'm really looking to find answers and integrating this piece into my thesis research around how can we create social networks that actually bring us together and that foster the kinds of desirable change that we need to create in order to sustain our civilization. And I'm interested in analyzing, data around this in the context of my research, which I would be happy to speak with you more on a one-on-one basis because I don't want to hog up the group's time, but just in terms of potentially using one or more of these platforms to create networks where people could experiment with different techniques for fostering genuine like pro-social behavior and bridging differences, race, class, gender, caste, religion, all of these differences where we get carved up, politics, of course. So I wonder if you could speak to that, in terms of some practical, maybe starting points for how we could transform social media so that it brings us back together because it's become so terribly divisive.
So, wonderful question, Deva. And first, I'd love to speak one-on-one when I'd love to set that up offline. So definitely yes on that. In terms of experimenting with non-divisive forms of social media, Taiwan is an interesting example where one of the key activists actually became one of the key activists that was part of an Occupy Parliament political action, where live broadcasts of the parliament were broadcast out to the rest of Taiwan in a sense by force. They basically went in there with 350 meters of Ethernet cable and started broadcasting everything that was going on to the rest of the country. She became the Minister of Technology or some title along those lines. And over the last year or two, they've been experimenting with some interesting results in terms of media spaces that are consensus building in terms of their architecture. So that's just a really, and I can find the link to an article describing that. I think that's something, if you're not familiar with that, maybe you are. If you're not, I think that would be an interesting use case to look at. In terms of some of the bigger questions that you mentioned, obviously, those are bigger discussions. One thing that I've learned as a developer, that was initially and still am very excited from technology, is I always avoid a technology first approach to any sort of a social or a political challenge. So I always try to think of technology as yet another tool within a social or a political trajectory or a movement or an action. So not that I don't think that these powerful tools can make a huge difference. I do think that they can. I just think that they always need to be thought of as something that happens within the broader social and political context, of course. And by the way, there is some interesting research coming out regarding also the panic that we now have regarding social media and how not to downplay the horrible effects, but also it seems as though we're kind of riding a wave now of negativity and perhaps also attributing too much negative value to social media, specifically the researcher Yochai Benkler, who's done some research on the effect of Facebook on the election, is an interesting research work that shows that even though there is a lot of, I think there is a lot to be worried about in terms of the overall effect on discourse around the planet, there's also a current effect that we're going through where we're also panicking and too easily blaming, just similarly to how we were too easily assuming that technology is going to save the day, we're also now too easily blaming technology for ruining the day. I think we're kind of going through a bit of a roller coaster ride along that kind of curve. So, just a small word of warning on that. I'm not sure I can speak more deeply on any of the other points, but I would love to continue this dialogue if and when you want to.
Thank you so much. I will find a way to be in touch with you after the colloquium. Thank you.
Great. And I'm no doctor, by the way.
Okay. Thank you for the correction.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other hands up that have not been. Let me think for a second. Rondan, you had a question, but I don't know if you had to leave or not. So I think you had to leave. So maybe we'll end here.
Sorry, Dr. Sid, I was unmuting myself. Yes, thank you. I was a bit raising and lowering my hand because it seemed like whatever questions or comments I wanted to make were sort of covered, but I will just make them anyway, briefly, if it's okay. First of all, thanks very much, Arnon, for your article that we read before coming here. It was very interesting, and I was actually looking forward to some discussion on that, but I'm glad that you continued the discussion as sort of where you left off from the article. You asked the question about regulation. We see with sort of climate change, what happens when the world global community tries to have some sort of global regulation. One, it's very, very difficult and time consuming, and then it's very fragile. Someone can just come out of it very easily. But, and that's just the nature of global sovereignty, national sovereignty. But I think, as you mentioned, this might be something that perhaps only I like the word that Gayatri used, sophisticated people and nations would be looking at in the first instance. But still, I think regulation is looking more at like the crimes, like the really hard things. Like if there's no real effort in trafficking, we shouldn't expect to see any regulation, trafficking in people, that is. I don't think we can expect to see regulation in these areas anytime soon. And then, so going to work, but you mentioned that anyways, which is why I didn't think I needed to say it. Then the question I wanted to ask was related to the other two questions that were asked by Sophia and again Gayatri, it was more, I mean, you see Facebook now, people are just voluntarily giving up their information. They're joining all these challenges, first son for first daughter, this and that. They're giving away information. Even myself, I'm amused that I just realized how much I look like one of my cousins because every time I post a picture of myself, Facebook wants to tag that person. And so people, even those of us who are a little bit aware of the issue, we're still lagging behind in making a real change. And a few years back when I decided to leave Twitter, because of the issue of unless you open up your account to all the robots, there's not much visibility. And I left, and Twitter doesn't miss me. It still continues. And Trump is still there making all his comments and whatnot. Just now I can't see them. So I'm the one who lost out by leaving Twitter. So I guess what I want to get at with that is, when do these mainstream platform, when do they start to feel the hurt if people become more sophisticated and decide to leave? Because you mentioned this might be something only in the US, but I imagine even if they lost the entire US, they still have the rest of the world where people would, even if everyone in the US said, okay, I can pay $5 a month for, or a year for another platform, that's a lot of money still in India for someone who's using Facebook for free. So when do those people, the existing service providers, when do they feel some sort of threat from alternative networks? And that's it.
So maybe, so I think you're touching on some tough challenges, but just maybe two optimistic comments. One regarding regulation. Unlike other areas of life, specifically in the world of global digital platforms, there is a very strong vulnerability that these platforms have to localized regulation. Once regulation is diverse enough around the planet, then the business model of these global platforms really breaks. And that's just an interesting thing to notice, because think of for example, a multinational organization that instead of trying to harmonize regulation, actually focuses on the opposite, on creating diverse regulation that fits specific needs, thereby creating a situation where the global platforms actually starts to fail. So it's just a different way to think about regulation and to exploit the specific vulnerabilities that these global platforms have. That's one point. In terms of another perhaps point of small optimism, and the platforms, as you said, they're not missing you. And also you said Facebook, even if they don't have all of the US, they still will generate revenue. It's true, but the global hold that these companies have on the planet today has to do with their financial strength. And their financial strength is not just something that has to do directly with their revenue. Obviously, it's related to that. But the current valuations of these companies is based on an estimation that they will remain global monopolies. That's why they currently are valued on the stock market at such high prices. So, and they were valued at super high prices even before Facebook started to generate revenue, because everybody understood that there is the potential for domination. So once domination it stops being a viable business strategy, as the world resists these global monopolies, then I think there is some vulnerability there that has to do with the way that they're valued and the place that they will have in the world in terms of the influence that they will carry. So I know these are not direct answers to the concerns that you have, but just trying to point at some vulnerabilities there as well, and how these vendors, may perhaps, just similarly to how they came into our life so quickly, perhaps they will also disappear quite quickly as well when the tides really change.
Thank you very much. Those points do make a lot of sense. Thank you. And that is a little bit of more optimism in this area. So thanks for pointing that out.
Okay, so Arnon, I think we should call it quits. What a wonderful morning. Morning for us, and early afternoon for people in India. And as you've understood, there are people scattered all over the place now in Africa and North America. It was really interesting and edifying and great fun hearing these things from you. You and I have had conversations in the past, and we've touched on some of these issues. And now hearing it in a compact form was, for me at least, very helpful. So the fact that what Arnon said was his interest in working with people and spreading some of these ideas through mutual work, that's something which is really also typical of him. And I think that we should all see that as a possibility for those of you who want to know more, who want to talk more, understand more. Arnon, I'm sure, would be interested in having conversations with you. And he also suggested working together, perhaps around women empowerment in the villages, and what these ideas that he's presenting, how they could be utilized for the benefit of women in the villages. So Arnon, thank you for really stimulating, very interesting talk. The fact that people knew parts but not everything is a great sign that you've helped us conceptualize what you're talking about in more sophisticated and understandings than we had before. And who can ask for more than something like that? So thank you very, very much, not just for what you said, but also the ways that you talked about things. Really great fun. So, and for everybody who was here, have a nice continuation of your day, and take seriously what it was that Arnon had suggested about working together with women empowerment, and then seeing how and where that could go. So Arnon, thank you very much, and I'll see you at the coffee shop soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for such thoughtful questions, for the time, and for taking this topic to heart. And Sid, thanks so much for this opportunity. I feel this is the real work, trying to think about these questions together. So really, thank you so much, everyone. I highly appreciate this, and have a wonderful rest of day.
Yes, thank you so much, Arnon. Thank you so much for this talk. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.